early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.
Update for today by looking at the projection by the African Development Bank as regards the 20 fastest growing economies in the world. Interestingly, according to AFDB, Africa would dominate the list according to the projection for the year 2024. Out of 20 fastest growing economies, 11 African countries have been identified to take the lead. What are these countries? What do they have in common? To shed more light on this, we're being joined by in-house analyst. We have the Vice President of Femy Walsh Media Limited, Dr. Idahosa Osamhanze. Glad you have joined us this morning.
Femy, good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Blessing. Good morning, Lagos.
I know you're very passionate about Africa, the African projects. You want things to go well in Africa, and things like this will always excite you. So the African Development Bank has projected for its economic outlook for the year 2024, looking at the 20 fastest growing economies in the world. The projection is 11 African countries are going to dominate the list. What's your take on this? How do you react to this? It sounds like good news, right?
Well, it's good news, but again, it's not new because everybody seems to understand and be on the same page that Africa has been how do they put it now, the least developed continent in the globe, as it were, with so much untapped potentials, where other economies are doing hugely and they are exhausted what nature has given to them. Africa is here to actually tap into what God has given to them. And this, of course, we see that if we do things well, will result in some measure of growth. And I think that is what it is like, because there's a whole lot of room for expansion for African countries. But for me, the real issue would not be whether we're going to see a GDP growth. Is to see how do this growth in GDP translate into good life for the average African man. And I think that is the real conversation that we should be having.
All right, if we take the list of the top fastest growing economies in the world, we'll find that at number one we have Guyana, and their fortune changed when they discovered oil. And for now, they're producing about 645,000 barrels per day. But the projection is that by 2027, they should get to 1.2 million barrels per day. It's a small country, but they've been able to do a lot with the oil that they produce. How do you think they've been able to use this, which is not common to them, as a comparative advantage?
Yeah, it's the same point that it's different from what I just said. See, you have nature give you a lot, and you can tap into it. What is GDP? It's the sum total of what is produced in a particular country by your national in a certain period of time, which is usually 1 year. So you calculate it and say, in 1 year, this is what was produced here. Now, but the question for me is really not how much that was produced in 1 year, but how does what was produced in 1 year, directly impact the life of every man on the street. That for me is really, and that's why a lot of economists, starting from trying to recall his name now, from Oxford, had argued that we cannot continue to use GDP to measure the size of economic growth, because this money does not spread equally among people. So people are producing in your country, and those money, they are not retained in your country, but you still see a lot of undevelopment happening in most of African states. So you cannot actually use a GDP growth rate to define whether Africa is making progress.
All right. When you have this kind of projection coming from a viable source like the African Development Bank, you will agree with me that it's something to go by. But if you look at it, it looks good on paper. But in reality, what should be done when it comes to the action, the respective decisions that should follow these projections? Africa is being projected to be the fastest growing continent after Asia in the year 2024. And if you look at the GDP projection as well, but this sounds good on paper. In reality, with the potential in Africa, what should be the kind of deliberate actions that should follow this to ensure that these projections are something to go by?
I think a lot needs to be done by Africans, especially the government of Africa, in understanding that
By Africans, I would love you to break it down. Most of the time refer to the leaders.
yes, I'm actually talking about those who drive the economy and politics of Africa. They have a lot to do in terms of actually really making life good for their citizens. When you look at the world globally, you discover that the inflation rate is higher in Africa than any continent in the world. Why in the US people are talking about 2% inflation? Here we're talking about 31%. So, which is really pauperizing the citizens. And if you take, for example, what has happened recently in Nigeria, especially with the removal of fuel subsidy, coupled with the electricity tariff hike. I was reading from a business owner recently from Port Harcourt, and he was saying that his hotel got about 25 million for electricity for 1 month. So, and I'm asking myself, what profit is this kind of hotel going to make in this kind of an environment? And then, of course, you have to also complement with your diesel and the rest of it. So you find that whatever that we're doing in terms of factoring rates into businesses disempower the people rather than actually empower the people. So you take more money out of your pocket. So if you are commuting, for example, you're paying more. You're buying food, you're paying more. So you're giving and you don't have anything to live with. So like they say in popular labor parlance, you find that your take-home pay cannot take you to the garage. So this is a problem that most African states are facing. And this is because we have not done so much in terms of understanding the fundamentals on how economies work. That if you are saying you are maintaining or controlling inflation by increasing the rate of borrowing or lending by the banks, the people bear the brunt at the end of the day. So the people that you are struggling to save, they are the one paying. We just saw CBN new regulation, for example, in Nigeria, that's asking banks to take again another 0.5%
5%.
for cybersecurity from depositor. That's outrageous. Already, if you look at the level of deductions that we get from the banks, you put your money in the bank, by the time you are coming back, the thing is going down because the bank is taking them. And CBN is empowering them to take more from the people. So this is a problem. So you can see, if you look at all the reports through yesterday to today, you see first quarter declaration of banks. You see huge. Some banks are making 340% rise in terms of profit. Where is this profit coming from? Where are the substantial investments? Except from what is taken from the people. So this is the issue in Africa. And this is what Africa should deal with. Because commercial banks, by their natural setup, are supposed to aid society to have easy access to funds to be able to become productive. Who can borrow money in a Nigerian bank today and do business with it and make profit? Nobody.
All right. We'll talk about the banking sector another time, but let's look at what some countries have done with what they have that has given them the edge and the chance to grow. We talked about Guyana. Now let's look at Bangladesh. They're also in that list, doing so much with textile and even exporting. In Africa, some of these things or some of these resources are not just in drops. They're in large quantity in different countries. Some countries have cotton, which they can use to have a rich textile industry. Some also have oil as well and different other resources. What happened? That some countries are just on one product or they have just one stay and yet the economy is growing. What is the difference, apart from some of those things you just talked about, between Africa and some of these countries?
It still boils down to the same argument. There's this young lady, a Uganda lady, who spoke at one forum that was organized by the United Nations, and it was talking about competitiveness, Africa and Asia, Africa and the West. And he said, as a young woman, if you give me a loan at 40%, as it is in Uganda, for example, and you expect me to make profit, and my counterpart who is in Japan is taking the loan at 7%, how can two of us compete? So this is a problem. It's not that we cannot be productive. There's no access to capital for people. Now you understand that they say in elementary economies, the factors of production. You have land, you have capital, you have labor. Now, in all this, how is the state empowering people to have access, number one, to land, access to capital, and then, of course, you borrow this and hire labor, and then you make profit? It's not possible. So that's why you see a whole lot is not working well in Africa. People start a project and the thing goes down because it's not really, Africa has not created the enabling environment for businesses to thrive, especially small and medium scale enterprises. So if you're buying electricity today, for example, in Nigeria, 225 naira, that's crazy. Somebody was shouting the other day and I said, oh, I live in a 3-room. And every week I'm spending 100,000 to buy electricity. So how many hours do you stay in the house? So in that's about 400,000 naira for a 3-bedroom flat. That's crazy. Now you're not even using machine. Now imagine now that you are using machine and then you are using battery. Now I can imagine how much you will be paying for electricity. And that's different from what the landlord is going to take for you as rent if you are renting the shop. So how do you meet up? How do you compete? So the enabling environment for competition has not been created. And I think this is the area where the CBN really need to sit down and understand what regulation should be. And I've argued some time ago that, you see, when you have bankers as CBN governors, it's difficult for them to really see things from the side of the people. They always see things from the side of the bankers. What will make the bank to survive, and not what will make the economy to survive. That's why a lot of people are advocating that let's have economists, really, intellectuals, become CBN governors to monitor the policy and see how it can reflect on the common man on the ground. Because bankers seem to really be speaking for the banks and not for the people in most of the African states. And I think that's one of the lessons I feel that we can take away and learn.
All right, let's look at these African countries that have been projected to experience strong economic performance. You have Niger, the projection is 11.2%, Senegal 8.2%, Libya 7.9%, Rwanda 7.2%, Cote d'Ivoire 6.8%, Ethiopia 6.7%, you have Benin 6.4%, you have Tanzania 6.1%, then Togo 6%, you have Uganda at 6%. Now, if you look at these African countries, what are they doing differently from all other African countries? That's the first question. Then, what do they have in common? Then, are you surprised that Nigeria is not on the list?
Well,
Why aren't you surprised? Nigeria is not on the list.
Well, if you look,
Libya,
yeah, if you look at it, you started from Niger Republic. You see what just happened to the price of uranium. All this why the French government has been in charge, and now the junta came in and said, "Look, we are not going to sell uranium at the price I said by the French government. We are going to determine what we are going to be sell." So what they are actually selling is their uranium that's coming in. So that's making a whole lot of money for the economy. So you can see it from that perspective. And you also see the anti-French sentiment that is also emerging from Senegal. So where are you seeing this growth happen? Whether it's in Togo, whether it's in Cote d'Ivoire. So you can see the same sentiment that's underlying that is a part of Africa that is about to be free, or that is coming out of the apron string of their ex-white colonial master. So you can see this growth really happening in these areas. So when you see Uganda, for example, you also see a lot of anti-West sentiment. Don't forget recently, because of their stance on sexuality, that of course they were delisted from the AGOA membership. They have to move and shift towards the Asians. So most of these economies we are talking about are having influx of capital from Asia economy. And so they are building a whole lot of things. And this is creating a new level of income that is happening within the environment. And this is where you see this growth happening. So why would Nigeria not be on that? There's a whole lot of teaching issues that we need to deal with. And these are issues that, of course, are very, very unique to us. Issues that has to do with security challenge that has driven a lot of people into hibernation mode, as I want to call it, because people can't go to the farm. So what do? They just have to find a way to live. And a lot of people are moving out of the country because of some level of insecurity. And these are the kind of thing that you see here. You just imagine that if we can unleash the potential in the northwest and the northeast of Nigeria alone, and see that people are in the farm and production is happening, then of course we will see a rise in your GDP, because your GDP is a measure of the level of productive activity that is going on in your environment. So as it is with us, a lot is not happening in terms of production. So the GDP seems down.
But you've also said something about GDP in the sense that it could be misleading. It may not be an actual reflection of the economic growth of a particular country. What else can be used to measure growth if GDP cannot be relied on solely?
Well, people are saying there are basic indices that we can use. For example, how many people are we taking out of poverty on a daily basis? How many people have access to clean house? How many people have access to clean water? How many people have access to health facility? How many people have access to security? And you're looking at it, one policeman to how many numbers to guarantee sense of safety and security of life and property. Now, these are the things that you will use to determine whether there is a progress that's happening in society. That people can feel themselves, they can do work and earn a living. So when you say your GDP is rising and you are growing a GDP at 11%, and then the people cannot eat, or majority of the people cannot eat, then something is wrong. Because when you are computing your GDP, you take what the haves together plus what they have not have, and you divide it by the number of population. So it gives you always a very misleading number in terms of economic outlook. So if you say Nigeria had 216 million people, and you're saying we have a total GDP of 500 million US dollars, now you can count what is in your pocket. So it's possible to divide that average and say 500 million US dollar divided by 216 million people. So that is the money in your pocket. But when you check your bank account, you will know that you don't have such money in your bank account, because the money is actually in the hands of very few people who the economy favors. Because not all everybody are equally favored.
So in this case, knowing that GDP cannot be relied upon, there are other indices that can be put together alongside GDP. Is it time for countries to begin to look inward and set goals based on the metrics that will be measured?
Yeah, but a whole lot of people are talking about it, and even in the economic classes today, people talk about using social indicator to actually determine the extent to which a nation is developed. It's not that GDP does not have a role it plays; it has a role to also let you understand that
Precise.
this is the way the economy is making progress. This is a sector that is experiencing real growth. This is where stagnation is, and this also help for planning, not generally for the economic purpose, and to say, okay, if government want to shift attention from one area to another, you can see where is the growth coming from. Is it from the real sector? Is it from mining? Is it from real estate? Is it from the capital market? You can use the GDP to be able to establish where growth is coming out from. And then, of course, in terms of redistribution or diversification of your earning source, you can know where to actually focus on in terms of channeling the resource you have to do something. So, to that extent, GDP is useful, but we cannot use it to measure the level of the well-being of the citizens. That's the point I'm making. So for you to be able to measure the level of the well-being of citizens, you will know the number of people who have access to school. You will know the number of people who, when they go to schools, they have access to work. That there's clean water for everybody to drink. Access to water. Now, this is being measured globally. How many people have access to electricity? In Nigeria, for example, you still see we are still struggling. We still not have, over 40% of Nigeria has no access to electricity. More than 70% of Nigeria has no access to clean water. So these are the things that, of course, should be measured from time to time. And I think states are also looking at it, and globally, World Bank, United Nations agencies are also measuring these indicators to see at what level do people move in a particular year. How many now have access to internet? Now, this is, of course, fundamental now, even in measuring the well-being. Because if you live in a digital age and people don't have access to internet, to data, then there's a problem. Here, for example, we are still struggling with 4G. We don't have access. Not up to 30% of Nigeria have access to 4G technology. And because we have not been able to build a fiber that moves around. But if you go to a small country like Rwanda, almost about 96 or 97% of Rwanda have access to 4G. So anywhere you are in that environment, whether you are inside the interior, you can access 4G. These are all indicators that can practically be measured. And I think there are a whole lot of agencies that are measuring this already.
Let me shift your attention to what Dr. Kiwumi Adesina said about the African continent for it to experience the expected growth. He said Africa needs to have access to larger pools of financing and several policy interventions to further boost Africa's growth. Now, let's talk about this issue of financing. Earlier, you talked about factors of production, where you also make reference to capital and the rest of that. The issue of financing is also important when it comes to factors of production. For Africa, the projection is the African Central Bank will be the game changer. Talking about having access to a larger pool of funds, what is the way out, and what do you think will be the role of the projected central bank for the continent?
I think largely I will, to a very large extent, disagree with the submission of Dr. Akiwumi Ambode to say that additional that the central issue is access to capital. I think it's not more about capital in Africa. The real problem in Africa is more corruption than access.
Maybe that's where policy intervention.
Yeah, so I think for me, policy intervention huge, really, and I think those are the areas where Africa really need to play very big, so that we are seeing an economy that is evenly distributed. That governments, even if they want to do interventions, are intervening in productive activity. This is quite important. And so a lot of African countries, all we are doing is we're throwing money at poverty, and that doesn't work really. To say you are doing palliative You know, I was even listening to the CBN governor recently, and he was saying that, look, this heavy investment in palliative also had affected our monetary policies in terms of managing our inflation rate and not the rest of it, because you are pushing so much money to the people who are not actually productive. Now, we can actually get to be productive by putting money, you know, deliberately. And I think Mr. President, for example, in Nigeria, has that kind of a plan and program. Because during his campaign, he talks a lot about creating hubs. And I think we need to see those hubs working. We want to see agricultural hub. We want to see technological hubs created, where, of course, government put money to fund innovations. So it's like the knowledge lab and the fabrication lab put together at the same place. So while people are having to be creative and thinking, then government puts all this money that we are throwing to poor people that cannot make them survive. We just ask them to think an idea of what you can do. And when you think out this idea, then we can now fund the idea. And it has to be on paper. One of my sons came to me on Sunday and said to me, "Oh, Daddy, I need a loan." And I said, "Okay, for what? Say for business." And I said, "Okay, give me the papers." Oh, he said, "Oh, there's no papers." I said, "Go and prepare the paper and bring." Say, "What should be in the paper?" "Yes, it's a loan, so you have to pay back." "Tell me how you are going to pay back." So I need to see the books and know that it is possible for you to pay back. So I've given him an assignment. So I'm waiting for him to come back to me with the papers to say, okay, yes, I'm borrowing this sum of money. I'm going to do this business. I'm going to do this business. And this is my projection of sales daily. And then, of course, out of this sales, I'm making this S profit. And if I accumulate it in 1 month, I should be able to pay S amount. And in the numbers of years or numbers of months, I should be able to pay off everything. So we should be scientific about the way we deal with issues. And if government can really follow through, you will see creative people have access to funds. But what we have had in situation that people who are really genuinely needing this fund, because they don't have connect, they don't have access to collaterals, they cannot even access it. And those who don't need the fund are the one who gain the access because of the level of their connectivity to the lending system. So these are the issues that Africa need to do right. And this is where really the CBN also will need to put eye on the ground and see how facilities are given here and what's the rate of return and why people are not returning. Now, somebody should do that research, and then we'll have a finding, and then we can make the appropriate policy intervention to see that some of this growth that we're expecting actually happen. But unfortunately, Africans don't spend money on research. We sit down around in a cozy library and glean things from, aggregate things from the books and then put it together there as data, because we don't go to the field to actually see what is happening on the field.
I'm sure some Africans will not agree with you anyway.
Well, I am yet to see really where people have to. I used to joke with my friends, and I said, since you were born, have you ever seen MBS in your house?
Okay,
Collecting data.
maybe we'll get the NBS to defend themselves on that.
I've never seen them all my life. Now I'm approaching 60. I've never seen MBS around my
Perhaps
neighborhood.
they have your ways of
I've never seen him since I was born. So, and I've never seen anybody in my neighborhood who has been surveyed once.
Perhaps they have their ways of
Might not be
collating these data.
I've not been lucky to see them in my neighborhood.
Maybe not one-on-one collation. Before we move away from this issue, let's look at the projection of some of these countries that are listed as fastest growing economies in the world. Now, the report says that they have a chance to grow double the global average in the next 5 years due to the rich deposits of natural resources and other factors. Now, when it comes to natural resources, Africa is a continent that is known to be abundantly blessed with that. What is wrong with the utilization of these resources? that is made it not possible for Africa to grow at the level it should?
You see, it's again here issues with context. So when we're saying we're going to double earnings in the next 5 years because we have resources, we're also paying attention to the argument of sustainability. The emphasis should be on non-renewable sources rather than renewable sources rather than dependence or over dependence on non-renewable sources. Most of the deposits we are talking about in Africa, they actually falling within that realm of non-renewables. So we also embracing the conversation around sustainability that we eat today and the society that is left will have something to eat tomorrow. So you must also put this into your growth equation. Don't forget, for example, where in Europe they say no, by 2050, for example, we want to phase out all fossil cars. So if you go to Europe today, most of what you see are electric cars. And now most of those economies are working so hard. You see all the back and forth between America and China on the issue of electric vehicles. Now this tells you where the trend is. So which means if electric vehicle becomes so reliance on petrol, of course, will drop drastically. Then you must factor that as a risk into your projections and your growth. So all this has to be done within context. And we cannot do it in blank that we can continue to produce those things. And of course, don't forget, even the petrol or the gas or the crude is exhaustible.
All right, away from issues related to emerging economies, let's look at what is playing out in China, where the Chinese president is on a 5-day visit to Europe, starting from France. Some analysts they argue that this looked like more of a diplomatic mission on the part of the Chinese president. It appears China is up to something. What do you make of this visit? It's the first since 2019.
I think we spoke to this some time ago, whether 2 weeks ago, when the European came saying that, of course, they are going to ban EV from China and the rest of it. This is what you call economic diplomacy. So the president is going to Shoto and be able to speak big man to big man. I say, look, you can't do this to us because we all have our common interest. And don't forget, there's also so much of Chinese money in Europe. So for me, this is the path the world should take. The Georgia path, where of course leaders come around and have, common understanding on economic issues, and we argue it out. And when the trade secretary went to China, and the first thing he argued was that the fact is that China must have to find a way to cut their productivity in terms of the EVs, because so that it can go around the world. This is the argument. So for me, this is negotiation. This is for me heartwarming that the Chinese president is in Europe and. After a very long time, going to sit down and talk with leaders to say, yes, we are one. For me, it's a sign for peace. And if this can be sustained, then I'm very sure that all the even trouble spots in the world could also benefit from this kind of a diplomatic relationship. For me, it's a big one for Europe. It's a big one for the world itself, because we've been thinking, where is China in all the conflicts, whether it's in the Middle East or
They seem not to
in the
speak
East, or
much.
they're not speaking anything. But of course, extending a hands of friendship to Europe, for me, is a good sign. And I think that it should also be able to speak about the issues that are happening in the Middle East, issues that are happening in the east of Europe, and see how we can have peace globally so that prosperity can spread, really.
Now, talking about China extending a hand of friendship, do you see this hand of friendship well received by Europe? Do you see them being cautious because of China's alliance with Russia and the stand of the rivalry between China and US that has persisted a long time? How do you see Europe responding to this?
You must understand this one. We keep saying this here. In International Relation 101, what matters is interest. Is actually not, there's no permanent friends, no permanent enemy. As long as Israel could terminate, then of course a lot of things work out. So if Chinese having something to gain from Europe and they can put it on the table, and Europe also know that they're going to benefit from it, why not? And I don't think everybody may like war. China don't want to go to war with anybody really, but it's not that they don't have the capacity; they have the capability to go to war, because in terms of the size of their military, they are strong enough. In terms of technology, military technology, China is a top notch. I don't know if all this is happening, but they of course are respecting nations, because what China is about is extending their civilization globally, and they want the world to embrace China and to see the world prosper. So for Chinese is, how do we offload our problem? A 1.3 billion people, aging population, they have a lot to deal with. They have a lot to contend with, that will be talking about warfare. And I think economic interest is what is important here. And I know that he will get some good deals out of Europe.
Now, the reports emanating from that meeting suggest that the French president is going to be in position to urge the Chinese president to address the what we call trade imbalances, and also see how the Chinese president can use his influence, with Russia, to see how they can address the issue related to the war with Ukraine. How do you see this playing? Do you think this is possible?
Well, I keep saying, whether we like it or not, trade imbalance will continue. On Sunday, I was teaching in church, and I was saying to children that it was not good to be poor, because it's a sin to be poor. And a lot of people were like, oh, wow, but the Bible says there will always be poor people in the land. And I say, yes, I know, because God also knows that there are a lot of people who are very disobedient and they will not follow instructions. So that is it. So if you have a lot of disobedient people who are not following instructions, and God say X and you are doing Y, then you don't get the outcome of God. But God desires that everybody prosper, but not everybody will be obedient to the thing that God is saying. But God says, if you are willing and you are obedient, what happens? You eat the good of the land. Now, if you are not willing and you are disobedient, you can't get the good of the land. And most of the time, people are disobedient. And I think this is the problem in Europe and in most of America. Right.
Really, where we presume there's rule of law.
Yeah, of course, there's rule of law. You see, there's a level to which libertarianism is driving the world into laziness via social products. And that's why you're having a lot of people who are given to alcohol, who are given to drug addiction, because government is intervening.
But would you rather government doesn't intervene, or are there specific
the principles that build Europe and America is capitalism, which is hard work of every individual. And I think this is what governments all across the globe should pursue. That people should be hardworking. People should go to work. People should go to school. We don't need to indulge people for any reason. So this over-indulging of people is what is responsible for the diving of productivity in part of Europe. But when you go to China, it's completely different ballgame. You see all the Asians, everybody is wired to work, because if you don't work, you cannot eat. If you eat and you are not work, you are a sinner. So this is what democracy should emphasize, because capitalism is actually a part and parcel of democracy. And what's capitalism? Is people working and making their wealth. But what you have today is that you're seeing over-reliance on government. And that is why all the governments all across the globe, they have all borrowed to their throats.
But what would you classify actually as over-reliance? What are those interventions of government that should not be? And in what areas specifically can government intervene? After all, part of the primary responsibility of government is to take care of the welfare and of the people. So what can government do and not do?
Let me give you, or cast your mind back. If you have grown up in the village,
which most of us Yes, we had that.
Maybe except Blessing, who grew up in the city, so he doesn't know the village life. So if you have grown up the village, you'd have seen that the time that people were talking about good Nigeria, the good days in Nigeria, in the early 60s, the early 70s, in the 80s, what were our parents doing? They were working with their hands. And if you come to a community, and anybody who cannot farm, for example, in my own community, who is lazy, the community will make him to farm. As growing up as a child, from the day I became 6-year-old, my father has started to separate seed yam for me to plant yam alongside the farm. So that's the way life was going. And so these people in the village were producing yam. I was talking with Mr. Sam Oroje 2 days ago, and I was describing our local market. And he said, oh, that market where they used to sell yellow yam. And I said, go there now. It's only this Abuki yam you will see there. Because the people in the village are no longer farming. And all we are thinking is that government will be the one to come and put food on anybody's table. It is not the business of government to put food on any human being's table. We must first of all realize this. This is why we are talking about palliative.
Or is that a fair argument, looking at the fact that people still farm, but there are issues challenging farming in Nigeria, like insecurity? And you mentioned people referring to days before now as the good old days. I've heard stories of how there was bursary provided for students, how there was lunch provided by government, and some other things.
Yeah, in those days, you can ask in the whole of your village how many people were graduates. You can ask your mother, just put a call and say in 1970, in the whole of my village, how many people were graduate? You may hardly not find one. Maybe in the the entire local government, it may just be one person. How many universities did we have? You see, this were possible because the emphasis was not on paper qualification, which is what we are emphasizing today. There are people who have no business being in the university. We take them to the university, all in the name that everybody must have a paper to be able to live a life. This is where the real trouble is coming from. So the people, all of us who are supposed to be in the farm, where are we now? We are all sitting down in the towns looking for a job that does not exist. And the real job that exists, that is in the village, we have all abandoned it.
All right. I don't know how we succeeded in bringing Nigeria into this conversation.
Nigeria is part of the world. It's not the least.
Let's talk about China. We're talking about the visit. Now, there was a question I raised earlier, which you didn't address, and I want to point your attention to it, is the fact that do you think the Chinese president can use his influence to, his relationship or influence with Putin as regards the war in Ukraine? Will that be something to go by?
I don't think it's something that China will want to dabble into. I don't think that the Chinese president will talk about it because it's not within the sphere of his influence, as I may say. Yes, of course, Russia has a relationship with China, but I think you must understand the man Putin is also an independent-minded person. And the issue at stake are quite clear and obvious. And I think, in my own rating, that the only way to deal with this issue is simply that NATO allow peace to reign. That's the way. That's the only way out. And as long as NATO insists and they want Russia back out, I don't think that will ever happen. That will not happen. And Russia will, especially with a renewed Putin, will want to fight with his blood to see that didn't happen. I think what it is that people's boundary and sovereignty should be respected. And you look at the real issue here, and Putin has genuine concern. And that cannot be taken away. You remember the Cuba Missile Crisis? Well, of course, Americans find it absolutely very difficult to see a Putin or a Russia becoming a friend of Cuba in their backyard. So what is good for the goose is also good for the gander. Now, in terms of relationship, and everybody is protecting his security, we must be able to guarantee that sense of security. And that is what the argument that Putin has put forward, that yes, we have dismembered as common Soviet, but we've agreed that we don't have our borders close to each other. Because though we are now different country, but we are still brothers and sisters. So for you now to say you want to come and make one of my brother your military ally is actually an aggressive act against me.
All right. Even though this may sound like crying over spilt milk because the war is still ongoing, but before the war, do you think like China is pursuing diplomatic relations and trying to peacefully resolve whatever trade issues that may exist between China and other countries? Do you think there would have been a way for Russia to peacefully pursue conversations around this with NATO and even Ukraine?
Yeah, you see, I don't think it's real issues that has to do with this talk is not today. The war started just about 2 or 3 years ago. Since 2014, this issue has been on the front burner. This conversation has been on at the various levels of United Nations, Security Council. The talk has been on. So it only became a full-blown war after talks have failed. So it's not about something that they just woke up and said they want to do this. This is 2014. This crisis has been on. If you research it, you see. So it's not something that started yesterday. And of course, they've been maintaining same posture. That since Ukraine has been asking, they want to become. They didn't want an aggressor around the neighborhood. And of course, you see, one of the issues that, of course, Putin raised was that the fact that there were Russians who were in part of Ukraine that was actually being oppressed and suppressed by the Ukrainian government. That Russia also wanted that they be liberated. That was actually where these hostilities came in from.
So in reality, they're living as much as brothers.
Yeah, brothers, because they're actually brothers, because there are a lot of Russians in Ukraine. So this
No,
is
but
the,
if Russia wanted to liberate some of Russians that were on the side of Ukraine
Yeah.
and were not given fair treatment, it suggests that there wasn't such a brotherly relationship between them before the war.
Yeah, that is what I'm saying. You see, it's just like you see, for example, we talk. There's no, sorry, I'm bringing it back it home because at least it will make it a lot very easier. When you talk about marginalization in Nigeria, for example, where some people are dominant to take power, and then, like Adama Shomole will say here, the real majority who are the minority scattered have never been ever empowered by the people. So the big powers rule. So the bigger ethnic group, so just in Nigeria, Yoruba, Hausa, Igbo. What about us? Nobody think about us. So we are not even considered. We are not in the scheme of the things in terms of power allocation, resource allocation. People don't think about you. So this sense of injustice and marginalization, you feel it. So these are the some of the area we talk about. For me, that the only route to peace is justice, where people are treated fairly. There's a level of inclusiveness in what we do, and then we accommodate and carry people along, as it were. So these interventions you see from place to place. Take, for example, you also see in Paul Kagame say, look, we suffer genocide. We don't want South Sudan to have the same experience. And he's having a very serious presence in that place. And people say, oh, he's having an ambition. But they just feel that there should be peace in this region. So that does not make him an aggressor, so to speak. So these are some of the things you see that plays out in international relations, that people say, okay, let me be an advocate for justice and peace.
Now, I'd like to point your attention to a statement made by the Chinese president as regards the ties between China and France. Said the time is at a model for international community of peaceful coexistence and win-win cooperation between countries with different social system. If you look at these two countries, they have different social system, but they're trying to ensure they have a kind of coexistence in order to have peace and to be able to achieve common goals. Now, If these two countries strengthen their ties, what will be the impact on Europe, and could it be extended to Africa?
Well, these are diplomatic talks. And when leaders meet, you expect this kind of flowery statements to come out from people. Yes, there's really no history of antagonism between France and China. There's no such history, but of course, during the World Wars, both of them were at both sides, and of course, though China was not as dominant in that war as Russia and Germany at that time. So you find that they don't have big issue, really, because what's China issue today is about trade. There's nothing more, nothing less. China wants to sell their product. Any market that is open to them, they are friends. And so when the president is moving out, is the chief salesman of his own country is looking for market. And now Europe is also trying to conspire and say we are going to block the market because we are doing too much. so there's no way you don't massage the ego of your potential client. Like they say, customer is king.
So it's a diplomatic statement.
All right, we'll leave the conversation here today and watch and see what happens after Xi Jinping's visit to Europe. And let's see what will be the twin brother of Europe's reaction. We're talking about the US after Xi Jinping has returned to his country. But we hope that peace is pursued globally. Thank you very much, Idahosa Osamhanze, who is the VP, Femy Walsh Limited, and of course, our in-house analyst here at SOUQ News. You've done justice.
Thank you. We do hope that all nations embrace negotiation and diplomatic solution to all crises, and that's the only way. It's only when we have peace that we can have global prosperity.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.